Well, a few weeks ago, we began looking together at Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. We return there this evening, a letter filled with warmth and love and affection. Paul clearly felt a great deal for these believers. It's worth remembering he's only spent a short time in Thessalonica. Acts 17 tells us Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they spent just 3 weeks there. 3 weeks before being driven out by an angry mob. We're not told he ever returned. Just 3 weeks. But those 3 weeks saw many converts to Christianity, a church established, and so now, from a distance, Paul is writing to these believers. He's commending them. He's encouraging them. He's instructing them. But it is clear from what Paul writes that the opposition to the gospel did not stop once he and his mission team had been forced out. In fact, from what we can tell, particularly from chapters 2 and 3, it seems there was a fair bit of criticism continuing against the church and continuing especially against Paul. We don't see it explicitly, but reading between the lines, it certainly seems Paul's critics have been active. Certainly seems they're taking advantage of him being forced away. From what he writes, it seems like he's been the victim of a malicious smear campaign. We can make an educated guess about the sort of things they would have said. So much for the great apostle Paul. At the first sign of trouble, he just ran away. You haven't seen or heard from him since, you Christians. He's a fraud. He's a fake. He's only interested in the money, in the fame, in the glory. He doesn't care about you Christians. He's more concerned about himself than he is you. All of that and more is implied by what Paul writes here. And it could have been some of the church were perhaps getting sucked in by this opposition propaganda. After all, when trouble arose, Paul did leave. And he hasn't returned. They haven't heard from him since. So that helps to understand what Paul's doing here in chapter 2. Here he is reminding the Thessalonians of the kind of ministry he had among them. He's reminding them of his ministry. He's defending his ministry. Not in a defend your reputation kind of way, but in a defend the gospel kind of way. He realized the church was in danger of being brought into disrepute by these accusations. So he sets out to remind the Thessalonians of a few of the facts. And there is much here this evening for anyone involved in pastoral ministry, or anyone thinking about pastoral ministry. There is a lot here. If chapter 1 shows us a model church, this part of chapter 2 shows us a model ministry. This is what true, faithful, gospel ministry looks like. And I have found this to be a deeply challenging passage, friends. This is what you as a congregation are meant to see from your pastor. This is what you are entitled to see from your teaching elder. If you're visiting with us this evening, this is what you should expect to see from your minister. But this isn't just for pastors and ministers, is it? This is a model for ministry on all levels, whether elder or deacon. whether Sunday school teacher or CY leader, whether helping with the upper room or with the little tots, whether standing up in front of a group of young people at camp, or sitting down with your own children or grandchildren at home. Here are marks of faithful gospel ministry. And I want to identify 8 such marks with you this evening. Don't panic. We don't have 8 points. We're going to group them in pairs. I think most of us would feel slightly overwhelmed at the idea of an 8-point sermon. So just the 4 points this evening. But they're all in pairs, so it's kind of a trick. To kind of try and trick you to think that these aren't 8 points. We just have 4 points. Firstly, openness and boldness. The first 2 marks we can pull out: openness and boldness. Verses 1 and 2. Let's begin with openness. Throughout the passage, it's clear Paul is at pains almost to remind his readers how open he was, how transparent he was when he was with them. He's describing his ministry, and over he wants them to think back. Can you not remember, he says? Can you not remember these things for yourselves? The opening verse, verse 1. For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. Our coming to you was not useless. It was not fruitless. You know what happened during those 3 weeks, he's saying. He says much the same, verse 2. Though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel. And he presses this time and time again. Verse 5. We never came with words of flattery, as you know. Verse 9. You remember, brothers, our labor and toil. Verse 10. You are witnesses, God also. Verse 11. For you know that like a father we exhorted you. He's making it very, very emphatic here. His ministry had been a public ministry. It was carried out before God and before man. He had nothing whatsoever to hide, nothing to conceal, nothing to be ashamed of. So everything needed for his vindication was public knowledge. And he's able to appeal to the Thessalonians' knowledge of the facts. You know, he says. And actually, his ministry is so much above reproach, he can even appeal to the witness of God. Verse 5. God is witness. Verse 10. You are witnesses, and God also. What a contrast. What a contrast to some of the disaster stories we hear in much of the church today. Here's a ministry about which there is nothing to hide. Nothing underhand. There's a word here, is there not, for ministers, pastors, elders, deacons, leaders in the church. Anyone who is hiding stuff from God, from the church, from their families, from their friends. Faithful gospel ministry is marked by integrity, by openness. A second mark Paul highlights is boldness. Boldness. Verse 2. Though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. And so he's reminding the readers how he and Silas had been so badly mistreated at Philippi. And we actually touched on this morning. Acts 16, Paul and Silas, they were seized, dragged into the marketplace, flogged, stripped, exposed, and then arrested, thrown into prison. And maybe Paul is defending himself here against the accusation of cowardice to those critics who are maybe accusing him of taking cold feet at the first sign of trouble. And he's just reminding the Thessalonians, do you not remember? My back was raw when I came to you. Do you not remember the open wounds I had from my time in Philippi? And yet still I had boldness, fearlessness to declare the gospel. You see, he didn't hold back in the slightest in Thessalonica. On the contrary, God gave him the courage to go on preaching the gospel, whatever the consequences. What an essential mark of faithful gospel ministry. Boldness. You do know, friends, gospel ministers, they're made of the same stuff everyone else is made of. And truthfully, we can fear so many things. We could fear failure. We can fear ridicule. We can fear hostility. We can fear man. And it's heartening to think in another letter, Paul asks the church to pray that he would know boldness in his preaching. Ephesians 6:19. Pray for me that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel. Surely in these days, bold preachers is what the church of Jesus Christ needs, isn't it? So pray for bold preachers. And I suspect some of you need boldness too. And isn't it helpful to see where Paul finds his boldness? Verse 2, we had boldness in our God. It's a little bit like this morning, rejoicing in the Lord. Here's boldness in the Lord. Boldness in our God. All his boldness was in God, not himself. So 2 marks to begin. Openness and boldness. Let's think of our next pair. Secondly, God-centeredness and selflessness. God-centeredness and selflessness. Verses 3 to 6. In verse 3, he's assuring the believers there is nothing deceitful, nothing devious in his time with them. In fact, he reminds them of the Godward focus of his ministry. It's God-centeredness. Verse 4. We have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. So we speak not to please man, but to please God, who tests our hearts. The whole emphasis here is on God. God is the one to whom he's responsible. God had approved him. God had examined him. God had tested him, found him fit for service. And as a consequence, God had entrusted Paul with the gospel. And that's a really helpful phrase when we think of gospel ministry. Men entrusted with the gospel. Some of the boys and girls will know exactly about what it's like when the teacher asks someone in the class to take a message to another part of the school, to the office, or maybe to another classroom, delivering a note to another teacher. And I can remember that so well. And it was great if you were picked to take a message to someone in the school. You were entrusted to take a message from one place to the other. And it was expected of you, wasn't it? It was expected that you would deliver the message. And in many ways, gospel ministers, Sunday school teachers, CY leaders, you've been entrusted with the gospel message. So we're not owners of it. We're stewards of it, really. It's God's message, not ours. We're simply the messengers. So it's not up to us to alter it or to change it. We don't adjust it. We don't soften it. But as entrusted messengers, we're to be faithful in delivering it. This God-centeredness. Paul says, we speak not to please man, but to please God, who tests our hearts. Isn't that a powerful statement? We speak not to please man, but to please God, who tests our hearts. This is what it means to be in the gospel ministry. Speaking not to please men, but to please God. Do you realize how tempting it is to get the order wrong in that statement? Too many preachers speak not trying to please God, but trying to please men. Men who do not know their hearts. And it's so easy to get it wrong. But faithful gospel ministry is marked by God-centeredness. We live, we speak to please God. And then Paul goes on to describe his selflessness. Not only was he God-focused, God-driven, but he thought little of himself. Verse 6. We didn't seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. In other words, he didn't seek fame. He didn't seek reputation. He didn't seek status in the eyes of the Thessalonians. For sure he could have. He could have. Paul could have made a song and dance about his position, his authority. He could have played the apostle card. But he didn't. He didn't come to get his name up in big lights. He didn't come to get patted on the back. He certainly didn't come for financial gain. And maybe that was an accusation being thrown at him. And as someone who was sent to preach the word, he had every right to be supported by those to whom he was ministering. He speaks about that elsewhere, 1 Corinthians 9. But we learn Paul, Silas, and Timothy, that they gave up that right in Thessalonica. Verse 9 describes how they worked night and day that they might not be a burden to the church. Working hard to avoid any appearance that they were only interested in money. They weren't there to fleece the flock. They weren't there to take advantage of anyone. So this ministry, it's marked by selflessness. They thought little of themselves. So two vital marks of gospel ministry here: God-centeredness and selflessness. Let's come to our third pair, verses 7 and 8. Gentleness and readiness. Gentleness and readiness. Rather than making demands as an apostle, which he could have, Paul reminds his readers, verse 7, of his gentleness among them. And it's really quite amazing, the figure of speech, the picture he gives to them. He likens himself to a nursing mother, verse 7, taking care of her children. Verse 7, we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. Now, understand, Paul was no softy. He would have been a pretty tough guy. No one would have been able to endure all the beatings, all the hammerings he received without having to be tough, physically tough. And yet he speaks here in such an intimate way, such a tender way. We were gentle among you, like a nursing mother, taking care of her own children. Have you ever seen a mother with a newborn baby? And if everything's going well from the very first moments, there's an incredible attachment there, isn't there? And there's a sensitivity and there's a tenderness. And you see it again and again in mothers, don't you? At least you ought to see it. Gentleness. Gentleness, being tender and considerate, full of concern for the well-being of the child. That doesn't stop when the children are little, does it? Being affectionate rather than severe, rather than harsh, hard. And it's amazing. Paul, the Apostle Paul, likens his ministry to that of a gentle mother. He's stressing the softness, the tenderness he demonstrated in Thessalonica. He does the same later to Timothy, 2 Timothy 2, verse 24. The Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. We're living in a harsh world, aren't we? An angry world. And it seems increasingly so. Too many Christians are harsh and angry. Too many ministers of the gospel are harsh and angry. But as followers of Christ, we're to be different. We're to be kind, gentle. And it's perhaps stating the obvious, but with this picture, babies and children, they're demanding, aren't they? They're demanding. They're needy. They're time-consuming. They can sometimes be inconvenient. They can be difficult to work out and to figure what's wrong all the time. They require a lot of attention. So do children of God. Especially so new believers, baby Christians. So it's remarkable when we read of Paul reminding his readers not only of his gentleness, but then of his readiness. His readiness to invest his life with these Christians. Another characteristic of his ministry, readiness. Verse 8. Being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. So, can you see that there? This isn't just a sharing of the message, it's a sharing of the messenger. He's not just sharing the gospel, he's sharing himself with these believers. Literally, it's a sharing of their souls. When you share your soul with someone, you're letting a person in, aren't you? You're letting them in to see what's really there. And as far as we know, in the space of 3 weeks, these missionaries just opened up their lives to these Thessalonians. They got beneath the surface with people. And relationships were established and developed, souls knit together in the cause of Christ. This was not a hold at arm's length kind of ministry. This was up close, personal, intertwined, lives intertwined together. And I pray this will increasingly be the case here as I serve among you in Lisburn, that lives, souls would be shared together, bound together in bonds of love. Here's Paul reflecting on his short time with the Thessalonians. He's reminding them of his openness and his boldness, his God-centeredness and his selflessness, his gentleness and his readiness. Let's come to consider, last of all, industriousness and godliness. Verses 9 to 12. Industriousness and godliness. Just if there were any accusation of him being lazy or freewheeling or coasting in the ministry, Paul reminds his readers how hard he and his colleagues worked. Verse 9. You remember, brothers, our labor, our toil. We worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you. He speaks of their labor and toil. This is really his industriousness here. Labor and toil, very graphic words, these words. They speak of work that results in fatigue, exhaustion. You're to have in mind the kind of labor that is genuine hardship. This was no cushy desk job for Paul. Rather than being provided for by the Thessalonians, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they put in long hours, night and day, most likely making tents. Certainly that was Paul's trade, tent making. Hence the phrase today, tent-making ministry, where the gospel worker has another job to provide financially. But as we've said earlier, and as we've said on other occasions, Paul isn't making this a universal rule for gospel ministers. Rather, he's underlining something of what happened when he was here in Thessalonica, his work ethic, his toil, his labor. He would write later to them, 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 7. We were not idle when we were with you. He writes to Timothy, 1 Timothy 5, verse 7. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching, not dabble, not glance over the work, but labor. So good pastors, good ministers of the gospel, Paul makes very clear, must be laborers, hard workers, grafters. There must be industriousness. We then come to the eighth, the final mark of all, godliness. Godliness. In verses 10 to 12, he calls the Thessalonians to remember his conduct while he lived among them. His godly example. Verse 10. You're witnesses. You saw this, brothers. God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. And having likened himself to a mother, just a verse or two before, he now likens himself to a father. It's quite striking. Verse 11. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. So do you see this gospel minister, this church planter, this missionary evangelist? There were times when he was like a gentle mother with these believers, caring for them, attending to them, looking after them, giving himself to them. But there were other times when he was like a godly father to them, exhorting them, encouraging them, urging them, challenging them to walk in the right direction. And both were there. And this is his deep concern for the Thessalonians, that they would live lives worthy of God, live lives centered on God, lives that put God first, that honored Christ. And he lived that among them himself, but he also encouraged them to live in that manner too, as father to children. So he's been reminding them of his ministry. Mark after mark after mark. And in many ways, this should be a congregation's wish list as they look at their own minister. Openness, boldness, God-centeredness, selflessness, gentleness, readiness, industriousness, godliness. This should be a congregation's prayer list as they pray for their minister. But it isn't just for pastors and ministers, is it? No. For anyone at any level of spiritual leadership, surely these marks must be present. So I ask myself the question that I hope some of you are asking too. Is anybody sufficient for these things? Certainly I'm not. Is anyone sufficient to be this kind of leader? And surely we must all admit our insufficiency for these things, our weaknesses. And we must come increasingly to the only one who is sufficient, the only one who is able. Not Paul. Not Paul. But Paul's master. Paul's Lord, Jesus Christ. Because after all, each of these marks, Jesus Christ demonstrated absolutely perfectly. Openness. He said in John 18, verse 20, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Christ's ministry was a public ministry in full view of God and man. He had nothing to conceal, nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. Boldness? Well, Jesus faced much worse opposition than Paul. Much worse opposition than any gospel preacher, for that fact. And yet he demonstrated great boldness, an awesome fearlessness. Think of how time and time again he went toe to toe with the religious leaders of the day, rebuking them again and again, never once softening or adjusting the message out of fear of man. Boldness. God-centeredness. Well, one of the great hallmarks of Christ's ministry was the priority he gave to his Father's will. John 4:34, he said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Luke 22:42, not my will, but yours be done. Selflessness? Well, no one has been or will be more selfless than Jesus. His thinking was always geared towards others, not himself. Do you remember when he washed his disciples' feet? It was one of the lowliest, one of the most menial servant duties. And as they were arguing about who was the greatest, he got up from the meal, took a towel, and began to wash their feet. And Philippians 2 verse 8, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Gentleness. Matthew 11 verse 29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. A bruised reed he will not break, a smouldering wick he will not quench. Never once do we see him harsh, cruel, always perfectly patient, full of grace. Readiness. Just as Paul was ready to share his life with the Thessalonians, so Jesus, he shared his life with others. He invested his life with people. He sat down and ate with them. He traveled with them. He poured his life into them. In the space of his short ministry here on earth, many, many people experienced firsthand his grace, his love, his peace. And Jesus was industrious. And never once could he be charged with laziness. We read Matthew 4:23. He went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. We're told there's over 120 towns in Galilee. He went from town to town, imploring sinners to be reconciled to God. Never was there such an inexhaustible, tireless, industrious preacher as Jesus. And then godliness, the Son of God. Godliness in the flesh. In Peter's words, he left us an example that we might follow in his steps. Do you see each and every mark? Paul had them, but they're supremely demonstrated in Christ. So if there's any hint of any of these marks in the servants of Christ here on earth, any pale shadow or reflection, well, that is down to the grace, to the mercy of Jesus Christ. And to him should be all the praise, all the glory. And those times when leaders fail and falter, when they frustrate you, when they disappoint you, when they let you down, which they will, which we will, which I will, surely our hearts, our minds must be lifted up time and time again to the one who never faults and the one who never fails, the one who never frustrates you, the one who never lets you down, our heavenly minister, the truly good shepherd, Jesus Christ. After all, said Simon Peter, to whom else can we go? He has the words of eternal life. Amen.